Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Kent Rogers, who's the Chief Executive Officer at EveryONE Medicines. He has over 20 years of experience across a number of major life science companies that you will likely have heard of, including Merck, Optum, EQRx. He's a venture partner at Arch Venture Partners, but of course, he's the CEO of EveryONE Medicines that we're talking about today. This company came up on a previous podcast episode. We spent 5 or 10 minutes talking about EveryONE Medicines with Ness Birmingham, who's a board member and I think early investors through Coastal Ventures. But as a very simple overview for me, and then I'll ask you, Kent, to give us the full story. What EveryONE Medicines is working on is developing a more scalable pathway for ultra-rare diseases using so-called N-of-1 therapies, antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs. You may be familiar initially, but potentially branching into other areas of medicine. The company was founded by Julia Vitarello, whose daughter Mila was diagnosed with one of these ultra-rare diseases, and she worked with Timothy Yu from Boston Children's to develop what I think was the world's first N-of-1 therapy. So I'd love, Kent, if you could give a little bit more background, anything I missed or got wrong, but also I really want to hear about your story as it pertains to EveryONE. What drew you to the company? What drew you to the role? Because it's a unique one for sure that we'll get into.
It's definitely unique. I think in some respects, the timing was really great from the perspective of being in this industry for, gosh, it's been actually over 30 years now. At some point you stop counting, but I've been very lucky to have been in multiple different perspectives where I had worked at very large pharmaceutical companies, small pharmaceutical companies. I got into the reimbursement end of our industry in the early 2000s, just before a lot of the legislation within the US started to be enacted, like the Medicare Modernization Act, the Affordable Care Act. And that really took, from a pharmaceutical perspective, the reimbursement teams and put us front and center in the commercialization strategy. So how you price drugs, how you distribute drugs, how you get them reimbursed, paid for, became a central component to the commercialization strategy, which it had been, maybe an afterthought or something that was considered at the very end of the process of bringing a drug to market. After doing that for about 20 years or so, I moved in the consulting world and had a much broader view of both large and small companies across the industry, which actually then led me to the complete opposite side of the desk, where I was not selling medications. I was essentially buying medications. So I led the role at United Health Group as the industry relations chief, which meant that I was on the other side of the negotiating desk with really big pharmaceutical companies and then emerging biotechs, the exact seat that I had been in before, trying to get drugs reimbursed. It was a great macro perspective from the standpoint that you could see the most recent trends in therapies. Obviously, there was a lot going on with insulins, a lot going on with opioids, but there was also a lot of really great products launching into the specialty space, as well as cell and gene therapy. And really enjoyed my time at the company, and the ability to start to understand and learn from the executives that were bringing drugs to market, the challenges that they were facing, but also being able to take the perspective that, having been in those roles, there were some fairly basic things that needed to be understood about not only the payer, but the regulatory pathways.
Right.
That led me into my role at EQRx as the chief commercial officer. We were trying to do something pretty different there and bring less expensive medications to market, really pull money out of the system as much as possible. I was drawn to that, of course, because having been at a payer, I think oftentimes the assumption is that, yeah, you want expensive drugs. We're actually trying to reduce the spend. I know
Right.
I'm not going to make the argument that you should feel sorry for PBMs, but operating at a very, very high level and dealing with all of the companies across the industry, it was it was our effort to really try to make sure that we could draw as much out of the system as possible. And EQRX was a really logical play to come back to the industry side. Unfortunately, when that didn't work out, a board member brought me over to Arch. And so yet another side of the desk where I was listening and hearing pitches about emerging companies that were trying to figure out how do we get our science across the line in phase
Yeah.
one, phase two, phase three. How do we price it? How do we distribute it? And when EveryONE Medicines came along, it wasn't just the noble remit of the company. I mean, there isn't any greater cause than trying to find a solution to children that are dying of rare diseases. But it was also taking all of the experiences that I had had and be able to bring them to bear to create a new regulatory pathway, a new commercialization pathway for medications that frankly work. And the science, we have it. It's kind of a business issue more than it is a science issue.
Yeah.
So, and I've got a great investor syndicate already. I mean, there's everything really kind of aligned, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that commercialization regulatory pathway because to the naive outside observer, people probably think ultra rare N of one diseases are the biggest challenge in, in the rare disease paradigm of, yeah, it costs billions of dollars to get drugs approved. And then if the market is small, that investment isn't recouped. And so people do that math upstream and they don't invest in the first place. But I think you all have a clever way of approaching the market. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about that, or how you take these, the thin slice of ultra rare and actually group them together in a way that might be a much bigger market, actually.
Yeah, happy to explain that. And it's interesting with disease states that are this rare, and we're talking maybe one or two kids, maybe up to 10 or 15 kids across the globe. And that could be an occurrence that you find over time. And maybe take a quick step back. So the area that we're in is the antisense oligonucleotide space. This is science that's been around since the late 70s. It's basically a single strand RNA, a spelling error that we're fixing. It's not a cell and gene therapy because we don't operate in the DNA space, we're in the RNA space. But in that respect, we're not small and large molecule, we're not cell and gene therapy, we're somewhat in the middle.
Right.
And so we are considered a drug. It is a lyophilized powder that's reconstituted and given intrathecally for administration to treat a neurodegenerative disease. But each of these are unique variants of a mutation. So you may have, for instance, Niemann-Pick disease is a lysosomal storage disorder disease. And it is a rare disease, but the variants of the gene mutation that causes that disease can vary widely. There could be 4, 5, 600 different variants that are the real cause of Niemann-Pick
Right.
disease. In children, we're finding that there are very rare occurrences where an ASO is amenable to treating that variant. That spelling error can be fixed rather simplistically and kind of elegant in its simplicity. So the science is here. The challenge is that there is no regulatory pathway where you can trial a drug when you don't have a population to try it in. And when you consider what the regulators are currently asking for is they want animal studies. First you do in vitro, then you do animal studies, then you do human trials. This can take anywhere between 10 and 12 years. It can cost $1 billion up to $2 billion just to develop a drug and bring it to market. That isn't a construct that plays here.
Yeah.
And what's also great is that antisense oligos are relatively straightforward from a manufacturing perspective, highly stable. As I said before, it's not cell and gene therapy. It's also not CAR Ts. So we're very much like a regular drug manufacturing. It's just the patient population is so small. So our effort to try to generate evidence, by all accounts, the regulators are saying, just bring us some evidence to have this conversation, is to maybe over-index and bring them a lot of it. But
Yeah.
there's some method behind the madness, if you will, and that being able to bring one asset to a regulator and have them apply that to variants across the globe and disease states, you need to bring them more than just one medication. So the thinking is, how many do you need to bring them? We don't really know the answer to that, but we're going to try to bring at least a handful or more. So 5, 6, 7, 8 ASOs. And in the course of doing that, when you're having these conversations and discussions with regulators, you're bringing in the same in vitro assays, you're discussing the same GLP tox strategy. And when you're doing it over and over and over again, you're by action demonstrating the repeatability of the chemistry.
Right.
And so it's a bit of an overused word right now, but there's a platform concept that's in there. And if a regulator can see their way to approving the platform, then the bar of clinical evidence that you need to bring for approval should be commensurate with what you're trying to study, certainly from a population, but also from the risk benefit. These are kids that are dying. They're not going to have a
Right.
chance at life without treatment.
Yeah, that's what I think is really interesting about what you're doing, because if you tried to do this in something where the risk benefit wasn't there, it would just be a non-starter. But the opportunity to help is so clear. How is there anyone who's tried something similar to this, either succeeded or failed, that you can learn from on this? Because from a first principles perspective, it makes sense. You take this risk adjusted view, and you could, under a different set of principles, say these kids, we need to try something here, and so we are going to improve the platform. And I'm wondering if this has been
Mhm.
tried in any other parallel pathway that you can learn from.
In this small and large molecule, no. And unfortunately, in cell and gene, I think they're running into a couple of different barriers there. But we can take a page out of vaccines. There are a couple of cancer vaccines that have followed a similar platform like approach.
Interesting.
And also in the medical device space. There's certainly other examples where clinical evidence was not robust, but
Right.
that the risk benefit was strongly in favor of taking what evidence they could have to ensure safety and then trying it. That's essentially what we're going to need to do here. And I should say the regulators are aware of this. I mean, this isn't something that we're bringing to them. We're only one
Yes.
company. There's hundreds out there with multiple modalities, and we're just one modality. So they get it, but they also are trying to contend with the idea that instead of, dozens and dozens of drugs for dozens of disease states, it could be thousands of drugs for
Right.
dozens of disease states because these variants are so replete. And, that's a logistical challenge, right? How do we get that many drugs approved, that many applicants, and how do we go about it? So we're actually in a pretty unique position to be engaging and communicating with regulators across multiple countries very early in the process. I mean, we're getting conceptual alignment before we even open the trial. So that when we start down this path, they know we're not trying to just get these one or two or five or six, eight drugs approved. We're trying to create a pathway to get number 8 to number 80 approved in a different way. And they're understanding what we're trying to do.
I'd like to dive into which countries are picking up on this most quickly. Before we go there, I'm curious around the kind of evidence and any themes that you're hearing. I'm sure it's a combination of safety and efficacy and generalizability across the platform, but what's the relative order of those kind of things?
Mhm.
What do they want to be seeing?
Yeah, it's a good question. And generalizability is an interesting concept and one that we ran into quite a bit at EQRX, because when you're trying to take basically the application or data enabling package for one product and apply it to other products, well, you have to have a lot of similarities in order for you
Yeah.
to do that aren't well defined currently. And so you're kind of defining them, getting feedback, negotiating approval that then becomes precedent. Setting precedent is pretty hard to do.
Yes.
But, what I think in general we're hearing is that FDA is taking this very seriously through the development of the Rare Innovation Hub. They've taken CEDAR and CBER and basically trying to create a bridge between the two and, developing a more centralized point of contact. This is early days. I think it's going to take a while for them to figure out exactly how to approach this, but also how to manage the unique pathways that they're going to have to develop to not only review, but also approve the medications. So honestly, I don't see that really formulating something that's more permanent for, several years to come. I do think there's a lot of good effort in the legislative space to try to give guidance and or capability to FDA. But with a change of administration, as you can imagine, there's there's a lot of
Yes.
shakeup going on right now, and I don't think anybody can really predict what will happen in the government, early 25 to, early 27 or
No.
28. So even prior to the current administration, coming into office, we really saw a more amenable environment in the UK and rest of Europe. So we had been talking to regulators in Germany, Italy, UK, France over the last couple of years. And we started to really find traction in multiple countries by saying getting a clinical trial authorization, basically a clinical trial approval to launch and start generating evidence is pretty straightforward. You bring the package to them, you go through a series of conversations and discussions. and then launching that trial to generate the evidence, puts us in a position to be able to start creating proof of concept. If we can bring that to the US and the US, can see their way to saying, oh, if Europe did this, we can follow that path. That's the general idea. But in the course of doing this, we actually have found, certainly in the UK, they're very proactive about saying we need to do something broad-based, not just the drug component within the rare disease space.
Yep.
And in fact, just a few weeks ago, they launched their fourth iteration, I think it is, of the Rare Disease Action Plan. It's all encompassing: access, communication, treatment centers, obviously medications as well, and regulatory pathways and reimbursement. So we're in a great space to be kind of entering in with solutions and providing them clinical evidence so that we can negotiate something new. And if they're ahead of the game, great. FDA can follow.
Yeah, it seems like the UK is probably a dream scenario for a company like you, right? Because they have a clear commitment to this. There is a way to engage with the system from a top-down perspective, and they've been very clear that rare diseases and pediatrics in particular are a major priority, right?
Yeah, and it from an investor perspective, it's definitely a page out of a different book. There's a kind of launch sequence, if you will, that most companies will follow, where the market in the US is always
Right.
considered the largest, and then you maybe go to Europe, start in Germany. It's a great reference country because it's more open. The UK is usually the last place you go because it's a
Yeah.
restrictive environment. They have a limited healthcare budget that they have to follow. The negotiations are long and usually protracted. But the nature of rare genetic disease, it doesn't necessarily follow population. There isn't a one-to-one correlation. You might find so-called genetic islands, if you will, in parts of the world where the occurrence of one particular variant is 50 to 100-fold what the rest of the population might find. So it is an interesting dilemma in that, the leverage, if you will, of having a small population convinces a regulator to do things differently.
Right.
What if that population is a couple hundred? They may say, well, you know what, you have to go the traditional route. That's also really unreasonable. Is it a couple hundred in one country, the world? Are they
No.
all drug eligible, drug seeking? Where are they in the stage of their disease? These are all the kinds of nuanced arguments that you have to be able to have and lodge with a regulator to have a productive conversation. But certainly they understand that in Europe, and we're finding some pretty interesting scenarios where populations can really pop in one geography versus others.
Yeah, yeah, and what you're saying about defining the size of the population reminds me of Biogen's ALS drug, which was focused on the SOD1 carriers. And in the UK, there's a big discussion about, okay, ALS is a rare disease, but SOD1 ALS is an even much more narrow subset of that. But
Right.
were those patients biologically sufficiently different enough to consider it a separate disease or not? And this became really important in the reimbursement pathways in the NHS. And I can see that being a frustrating thing to be on the drug development side to get that far along and then you have to wrestle with these questions that are hard to answer definitively, right? Very hard.
Yeah, exactly. And if you look at it from their perspective, and I think from my background and experience, I really do appreciate the population-based health perspective that they have to have. I mean, they're
Yeah.
responsible for not only the safety, but the financial component and just the logistical component of bringing this many drugs to market. So you have to pass a lot of bars that are traditional in the sense
Yeah.
that can you manufacture with, good manufacturing practices? Are you able to be audited in terms of how you actually research and develop the drug? How are you promoting it? How are you distributing it? I mean, these are all components that are included in these discussions and these negotiations with regulators. And we're prepared for all of it. I think what is going to be unique about this and continues to be the challenge that we're going to need to face is that, thinking of a disease state in terms of a larger population is the traditional approach, protein-based approach. When you're looking at the causative component of a disease that might be one single variant and that you can actually treat that variant, it's going to work because it's individualized to that variant. But how do you characterize what is efficacy? Even harder, right?
Yeah.
To a parent of a child suffering from that disease, the smallest things could be the biggest improvements that show real clinical evidence of effect. But, that's also going to be something that we need to work with regulators on because a primary and secondary endpoint doesn't really apply in disease states that have such a broad range of presentation.
Yeah. Having worked, especially in the US, on both sides or multiple sides of the industry, I'm curious if you have any insights from that people who haven't spent time on the, on the buy side, so to speak, they just may not get because they've never been in those shoes. What do people on the drug development side miss that your years being on the other side of the table helped you
That's a
get a
good
better handle on?
I'll answer it in a couple of ways. It's a really good question because I think where on the business side of it, the unfortunate thing is something that's scientifically relevant isn't always commercially viable.
Yeah.
Either the method of delivery. I mean, there was a company in the US that had a postpartum depression product that had I think it was a 23 or 24-hour infusion. I'm not even sure logistically how you do that.
Wow.
Now, it may be very scientifically relevant and it
Right.
may work, but logistically, how do you do that? And so I think when you're in a phase 2 to phase 3, you're in the go, no go decision in the research and development space. You really have to have somebody that's both in the commercialization and reimbursement space come in and talk and have a dispassionate conversation because sometimes the scientists can be really in love with that molecule and love the science, but not be able to kind of step back and look at the larger picture of whether or not the product can either get to market or when it does, is it able to even be used? And then that's the unfortunate component of being able to bridge the component of science and commercialization together. So I think that's one component is that you've really got to think about this stuff very, very early on in the drug development process. The other component, and you hear payers and regulators say this, and sometimes they may say it, but then the process to actually execute it is harder. But you've got to engage early and often. This is a human system. These are individuals. These are that they have their own concerns, their own perspectives, their own opinions that they bring to their roles. And while they may be in a really high position of power and influence, they also have their perspectives. So knowing them, understanding that, you only get that through interaction and engagement. And I used to, it was in my role at United Health Group, I would routinely tell manufacturers that you should really look at the payers and the regulators as partners. They are the gatekeepers, yes, but that doesn't mean that they're there to say no.
Right.
It's challenging innovation. It's not stifling it, it's challenging it. The bar should be high. We're producing medications and developing medications that are going to be put in your body to be used to treat a
Yeah.
disease. You shouldn't be causing worse conditions than that. So, I think that just being able to have that perspective and engage them, would be something that is unfortunately still a little bit unique.
Yeah. What is it that you think is causing the UK and the EU countries you've been talking to engage more deeply on this? Is it something about the single payer systems that they can think about this cradle to grave? Is it something different? Is it just a mere quirk of what the FDA focuses on now and where they're moving towards? I'm curious about that.
Probably yes to everything you said, but
Yeah.
to give it a little specifics that for folks that are watching this and their ratification that may or may not be familiar with multiple different countries and health systems. In the US, we don't really have a budget. I mean, we do, but we don't follow it. We're routinely over budget and going into debt. That's just sort of how we
It's in
operate,
the
right?
news a lot these days. Yeah.
Exactly. So from that perspective, we're not working within the confines of what we can afford. A drug gets approved here probably a lot more often than it might get approved in other countries, just for the mere fact that they cannot afford that medication and that manufacturer may not be willing to price that medication low enough for it to be approved in that country.
Right.
And make no mistake though, like in the UK, they do negotiate and they have rebates and they have all the same constructs that we have in this country, but they're operating within a limited spend. And so from that perspective, they can be, rather black and white in decisions about medications that are treating life-threatening illnesses. But they also recognize within that macro view of the totality of care. The palliative, in our case, the palliative care, which unfortunately is what it is today for children that are suffering from life-threatening and ending illnesses, that cost of therapy, very much like a normal lifespan, 80% of that cost is in the last years of life.
Yeah.
So we are doing a lot of work in partnering with outfits within the UK and the rest of Europe to actually characterize what is the cost and the burden of illness today. When you say burden of illness, that's a business term. It's a very cold and kind of a sterile term, but it's used. And that's the vernacular that you have to be able to speak when negotiating with regulators. There's a burden of illness here. If we're going to introduce cost to treat, Is it going to minimize or eliminate some of the cost in the system? It should. And so that would be some of the premise. It isn't just, the heartstrings of, hey, look, we're treating children that are dying. It's that we're treating children with dying that's science that is straightforward, that is safe, and actually could unburden the system from some of the expense to just try to keep these patients alive. That's not often an argument that you find in a scientific environment.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned here previously, but I lost my daughter when she was 10 days old, and I know that the system struggles to value what that impact was on me, right? There's just like, how do you measure the impact that it has on parents? And I wonder about that sometimes, of how you actually build a system that can at least pick up some of that cost that doesn't show up in the GDP numbers, right? It might in some kind of distant way, but not really.
Well, I mean, I think that's where what's interesting in Europe and particularly in the UK, they came up years ago, back in the 60s, a measure called quality adjusted life year. So they actually put a price on life. I don't know how you do that. I mean, I don't know how you do that in the sense that, you can take it seriously. But in absence of any other way to measure this,
Yeah.
you have to create some kind of litmus that you can then compare and contrast the continuum of different care. I don't think you're ever going to probably find somebody that's going to think a regulator or a payer or somebody that's in charge of the approval of medications is going to have that heartstring and be able to say, yes, we'll do this, because there's millions of other unique stories behind them. And so they have to be dispassionate about it. And, I see both sides of that argument,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But I think that's why we're really trying to take the approach of saying, all right, well, what is it that they need? How do we generate that evidence? But then how do we negotiate the gap that we can't give them everything that they need? And so let's try to figure out how to be reasonable.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. How did you decide on starting with ASOs? Because there are other modalities you could go after, but it does seem like RNA is in this interesting. It might be in a gap regulatory wise, but it's in a sweet spot chemistry wise. So that probably makes it much better than some of the other options you had.
That's really well said. I couldn't have said it better. You're right. It is in a really good sweet spot from a scientific perspective. ASOs were primarily because of the history of how the company was formed. Julia's story with her daughter Mila was groundbreaking. It was revolutionary. And you're seeing the same effort being employed with antisense oligos across the country, really across the world. And it's absolutely heartbreaking when you see parents that are doing their level best to try to save their child, and they're having to do bake sales and raise money,
Yeah.
millions of dollars just to get the trials started. I mean, clearly that's not sustainable and it's certainly not scalable. So from that perspective, focusing on ASOs was primarily a nod to Julia and Mila, who was treated with one.
How have you thought about building the company and team at Everyone Medicines? Because you have a period of time where you have some of the kind of known clinical development challenges that maybe any RNA medicine company would have, but you've got some very different elements going on, the regulatory engagement piece, but also potentially the ability to go relatively quickly from clinical development into some kind of commercial products. I'd love to hear a little bit about how when you sat down with how do I actually build this company and team, and your general approach to leadership, I guess, because when you come into a company like this, there's a lot of decisions to make, and they have a lasting impact. So I'm curious
Mhm.
about how you thought about that.
Well, I mean, from a leadership perspective, and this isn't, anything unique or revolutionary, you just hire people that are smarter than you that know their specific area. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I need to have scientists that know the antisense space. It's kind of like a pretty easy bar to
Yeah.
consider. From a chief medical perspective, that's somebody that knows how to run a clinical trial, knows how to deal with investigators, knows how to actually launch the process, deal with regulators, explain what it is that we're doing. I have experience doing that, but somebody that does that as their role, that's smart enough and has their own leadership qualities that align with, the culture that you're trying to build. That's the basic element, is hire the right team and get out of their way, enable them to do their job. I get the question every once in a while, well, how do you develop a culture? And, I guess in some respects, and there's a lot of books that are written on this, is that like the CEO of a company is the culture. And while I tend to agree with that, I think it also depends on what kind of CEO or what kind of leader you are. If you need to have control over everything and everything has to go through you, well, that in and of itself is a culture.
Yeah.
because the approval of things is sort of a natural element to how the company will operate. Does it operate slow or quick? Are people able to be decisive?
Yeah.
How much can they approve on their own versus having to go all the way to the top? So in some respects, I think just the way you operate creates a culture. But what I've really enjoyed about working in very small companies versus, really large companies. I've been at, like, United was 330,000 employees.
Wow.
This is probably the smallest company I've ever worked at, which,
Yeah.
is below double digits, at least at this point. Anytime I've been in a smaller organization where you have a singular focus, that really can help add to not only the way you lead, but the culture that's developed, because everyone is focused on the same endpoint here. We need to get drugs to market to treat children that are dying of disease. Full stop. Anything that gets in the way of that, or, even somebody that comes in and says, oh, well, we can't do this, we can't do that. Well, I don't know that this is the right place for you, because, we need to be we can do this. How
Yeah.
do we do this? And then I guess, last thing I'd mention is that, and I learned this early on in my career, that when you're in a really large company and sometimes you have somebody ask you a question, you don't know the answer to it, you feel like you're going to lose your job. Like, I was
Right.
supposed to know that, if I tell them I don't know, I mean, I'm out the door.
Yeah.
Whether you're in a big company or a small company, just say, I've never done that before, but let me figure it out. Because then you're not going to get in trouble if you did it wrong, because you're trying to learn. Hopefully you're not. But also, the way I kind of look at it is, I'd rather you tell me you don't know how to do it and then you're going to go figure it out,
Right.
than make me think you do. And then I don't know if I can trust you if the result is not there.
Yeah.
Right. So, it's a matter of being able to make people feel comfortable that they can make mistakes, because we're all going to learn from them.
Yeah, I think there's some really good points in there. Your point about what culture is a one of the things that I've heard that stuck with me is it's related to what you said about the CEO or founders often being kind of the bellwether, but another way to look at it is it's actually how people make decisions when you're not in the room, and
Right.
you get to that by role modeling what you would do if you were there, but really like the litmus test for it is, when you're not in the room, does somebody put their hand up and say, I don't know how to do that, I'll go figure it out? Or,
Right.
what is really how we do things around here versus how we do it when the CEO's in the room?
Well, and that actually, also brings up the point of communication, because yes, you do set the vision. I mean, there's going to be things that will occur. Obviously, you've got to course correct. The market's going to evolve, and you're going to have to develop opinions and
Yeah.
strategies to address those. Getting input from the folks that actually know more than you do about it can help formulate that vision for you. So it's not your singular vision, but the way you articulate it, and being able to make sure that everyone in the organization knows how to articulate that. It shouldn't matter whether you're in the room, right? Because then you trust your team, certainly your leadership team, to be able to keep that vision aligned. I think it's when the outside world, certainly investors, or if you're a public company, that they hear different things about where the company's going, or different vision, or the vision isn't aligned, I guess,
Yeah.
among the leadership. Well, that's when you start to see cracks, and, people start to jump in immediately and say the company is running amok.
Yeah. Are there any interesting moments or stories from your career that were particularly impactful for you as we wrap up here? You've had, I think, a lot of really interesting experiences that people could benefit from.
Well, I've had a lot of really good mentors in my career, which have, created these sort of seminal moments where you're sometimes told, look, this is your responsibility. Have the confidence to make some mistakes.
Yeah.
Obviously learn from the mistakes, but put yourself out there. I learned that pretty early on, but also know what you don't know, right? I mean, if you're in a scenario where you've got a blank sheet of paper, and that's a little bit of what we're really facing here,
Yeah.
and it's never been done before, be bold enough to create the solutions, but ask for a lot of advice along the way. And I routinely do that, certainly in my current role. I mean, even when I'm putting a pitch deck together to talk to investors, I have folks on my team, my board, people that have done this a lot more than I have, to say, give me your thoughts, give me your advice, and just lose all, pride. You've got to have a lot of
Right.
humility in your role to be able to say, look, if I don't know, I need to learn, and I need to learn from people that maybe have done it before, but if they haven't, they've got a perspective that I didn't think of. That's helped me a lot in my career.
Are there one or two people that you consider to be people you learned from that you'd be willing to share? I'm interested who's been most impactful.
It's funny that you asked because I was at Shearing Plow for about 15 years. That was the longest, so far, the longest tenure in my career. And when I got into the managed care role in the early 2000s, late 90s, we just had a bit of a lightning in a bottle. I mean, we were a large company, but we were scrappy in terms of our culture. And it was also a time when the bar was set very high on you better know your products better than your customer. And from a leadership perspective, you better know your customer better than I do, right?
Yeah.
Because the internet was becoming popular back then. I mean, that really ages me, but if you could go online and find something out about a customer as a leader, and then you asked an account person, well, what about this? And I heard they were merging with that. And, these two companies got together. Are they competitive? And the account person saying,
Yeah.
that's not a good thing. So we had a really fantastic team, and it's a guess here, but I think there's probably 20 CEOs, board members, and executives across the industry that came out of that same team at Shearing Plow. And
Wow.
so, people like Jeff Berkowitz and Greg Oakes, these are guys that have been CEOs multiple times in multiple parts of the industry. And just the way they present themselves, the kind of executive presence, the emotional quotient that they have has really served as great examples for me. And I still talk to them pretty routinely because we've been in evolving roles over time. But yeah, I mean, there's kind of a long list. Those two come to mind just because the experience we had at Shearing was really unique.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I really like that the particular part of the experience was that customer centricity, because I think something that is often missed in biotech when you're overly focused on the science, but you're not focused on the patients, the regulators, the payers, that you have not just one customer, but you have quite a few to balance. And the more you can really step into their shoes and empathize, the more successful you're going to be, right?
Having been in the consulting world as well as both sides of the desk, the positive is that it's unique that folks think that broadly and that
Yeah.
completely. And I think it's been said 80% of success is showing up, right? Well, think through all those multiple layers of what's going on within the industry, and you're already ahead of the game if you're thinking through that. How you execute the strategy, and obviously the financial component and everything else comes together to make success, but you've got to think in a totality instead of just in that narrow scientific view, for sure.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, how can people be helpful to you? Do you want to hear from, are you hiring any particular roles? Do you want to hear from investigators, families? What's the most helpful for you?
Yeah, no, appreciate the question. I mean, I think we're small but mighty, and we're going to have to probably stay that way because we're focused on the clinical trial and the execution of that for the next several years. But for the most part, what we're really interested in is those very unique populations that are suffering from neurodegenerative disease, and there are no answers.
Yeah.
And that's what really struck me about Julia's story, and continues to be something that I face with all of the parents that I talk to and investigators and clinicians that I talk to, is that they're desperately trying to find answers. I cannot tell you that EveryONE Medicine has all of them. And we know from a scientific perspective that there's only a fraction of these genetic variants that an ASO will treat. But other modalities are also a possibility. And our commitment is that if there is a variant, there are no answers, it's in that neurodegenerative space, send it to us. We can find out very quickly if it's amenable to our technology. If it is, we can know where to steer you, hopefully. But I'm sorry, if it isn't, we know where to steer you. But if it is, then, certainly we're trying to build a library of medicines over time to treat as many kids as we can across the world.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I love the vision for the company. You've made a ton of progress already, and thank you for taking the time to share it with us and for putting your years of your life to this. I think it's it's really like a fresh way of looking at solving this problem that I've never come across before. So I think it's really exciting.
Thanks very much for having me. Yeah, it's very exciting, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you too.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks everyone, as always, for listening. We will see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.